So we're going to begin with the Tosafos on Gimel Amud Beis. The Gemoro is discussing the halacha of Beis HaKnesses, and the central halacha is that one cannot destroy an old Beis HaKnesses, an old shul, before a new one is built. And then we had various different details about that. If another shul is in town, and what exactly that means, or is it an issue of neglect? Like if there's another shul in town, then there is no problem with destroying a shul before you rebuilt it because you have another shul in town. Or is it a question of even if there is another shul in town, we're worried you're going to raise some oinus will come to the community, they'll have pidyon shvoyim or something, and they'll spend the money on that, and they won't rebuild the shul, and so on. At one point, the Gemoro went back and forth. There was a conversation between Ravina and Rashi about at what point do we say that the oinus is no longer an issue. If they have the cash ready, we said that the oinus is still there because they'll give the cash away for pidyon shvoyim. If they have the materials ready, it's also the oinus is still there because they'll sell the materials for pidyon shvoyim. But once the shul is built, then there's not a problem anymore. Okay. Now Tosafos comments on this when Ravina asks Rashi, if you are arguing that they're going to sell the materials to give away pidyon shvoyim, so Ravina asks, if so, when they build it also, they'll sell it for pidyon shvoyim. And Abaye answered by saying, no, you don't sell your own house. That was Abaye's answer. But Tosafos is not commenting on the question, which is, if so, when they build it, they'll sell it also. If you, Rav Ashi, are claiming that they'll sell the materials for pidyon shvoyim, then they'll also sell it when they have the shul built already. That's what Ravina asked, to which Rav Ashi responded that you don't sell your own home. But commenting on that question, says Tosafos, it's 4 words, and what he wants, I'm not sure, but I'll tell you what I'm thinking. So Tosafos says, Yachi kibniya nami, pirush achi ispaluba. It's a small Tosafos on the side there on the right, under the Haggah, under the Tosafos we learned last week. Pirush just means to say, achi ispaluba. Only up until the point that they've davened there. Once they've davened there, they won't sell it. Well, why not? At this point in the question, where Ravina is challenging Rav Ashi and saying that you, Rav Ashi, are claiming that the people will sell the materials for pidyon shvoyim, and Ravina challenges and says, they'll sell also the shul. Says Tosafos only up until the point that they daven. Once they start davening there, they won't sell it. Why not? At this point in this Svara, where they're going to sell the things they have for pidyon shvoyim, what's the difference if they daven there or not? So I think what he's saying is he's making reference to a machlokes with regard to Kedusha's Beis HaKnesses. I think this is what he's talking about. It could be completely a fantasy, but I think this is what he's talking about. There's a famous machlokes about Kedusha's Beis HaKnesses. Is the Kedusha of a Beis HaKnesses d'oraisa or d'rabbanan? These opinions are expressed in the main sugya of Kedusha's Beis HaKnesses is in Megillah, which the next Tosafos is going to introduce us to, and we're going to learn some of it then. But over there's machlokes, and the Ran brings machlokes quoting from the Ramban, and there's the Yereim. On the one hand, you have the opinion which says that it's d'oraisa, and the Kedusha of Beis HaKnesses is an extension of Kedusha's Beis HaMikdash. The pasuk says, "Ve'ei yisham mikdash ma'at," that after the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, when you go into Galus, I'm going to be with you in a mikdash ma'at, in a minor Beis HaMikdash, and at least according to one opinion in the Gemara, that's a reference to Elu Bate Knesiyas and Bate Midrashis. So then Bate Knesiyas, shuls, and Beis Medrash get an extended halacha of the Beis HaMikdash. The other opinion that says it's the Rabbanon, And that pasuk is only an asmachta. It's not an actual pasuk to validate the halacha, but rather just a supporting text, but not an actual din. So if it's derabanan, so where does this kedusha come from? What's the gedder of the kedusha? What's the gedder of this kedusha of Beis HaKnesses if it's derabanan? So there's different opinions, and the Ramban writes that it gets the gedder of tashmishe kedusha. Because it's an object with which you do a mitzvah, because you daven and you learn there, therefore it has kedusha. And that's the Ramban's opinion. It has all kinds of applications, exactly how you define this kedusha. And it's a very fascinating sugya. But I think Tosafos might be referring to that. Achi Yispalul, until they daven there, then they can sell it and use it for pigeon shvuyim. If not for Abaye's response that says a person doesn't sell his own house. But once they daven in there, and the shul gets the kedusha, if this is correct, the Tosafos is of the opinion, like the Ramban, that the shul gets the kedusha as a result of the tefillah that happens there, then they're not allowed to sell it anymore. You can't sell it. There's all kinds of dinim about the kedusha of Beis HaKnesses, and when you're allowed to sell a shul. It's not so pashut. The poil, our shuls today are made on. Maybe we'll get into the next Tosafos a little bit as to why our shuls can be sold and how they're sold. But a bona fide shul in the original halachic Talmudic sense can't be sold stam hazai, or at all even. Maybe that's what Tosafos is referring to. If I'm b'chlal in the right direction, maybe I'm completely off, but if I'm in the right ballpark, then it's possible Tosafos agrees with the Yereim that's deraisa, but the kedusha is not chal until they daven. But that's a stretch because l'chora the kedusha happens right away if you say it's deraisa, just by the very fact that they've designated this property and this money and this material to be for a shul. That itself gives it its kedusha, certainly once it's built. So I don't know what else Tosafos would mean by saying achi spalluba. Like, well, what's he adding? That once they daven, then even Avina agrees they wouldn't sell it for a pigeon shvuyim. What's he adding? It seems to me he's adding that he's siding with the Ramban and saying that the kedusha, once they daven, the kedusha resides and they're not allowed to sell it. The halacha of the kedusha, the halachas related to the shul applies once they daven in there if they can't sell it. Maybe. Could be I'm completely off, but I think that's what he's talking about. Okay. Next Tosafos. So the next Tosafos is commenting on the practice of Rashi, who the Gemoro said that in Masa B'chasia, they saw a shul that was in danger of falling, of collapsing. And the halacha is when there's a danger, you can destroy it. You should destroy the shul right away, even if you don't have a shul ready in its place, because there's a danger. It's an issue of public safety. And the Gemara said that that Rav Ashi took his bed and put it there by the shul. And that way, as Rashi told us, he's going to be sleeping in the heat and the cold, and it'll be uncomfortable. And that's going to, remind him that he has to get the shul done, and he won't give up on it. And that's where there's no pshia, right? Because he's sleeping by the shul. So it says Tosafos, the tema. This is a curious practice. V'hamrinon, we are told in Tosefta and Yerushalmi, okay, that botek nesiyas, that a shul en yishena behem, not will sleep in them. Lo yishenes kva, not a permanent sleep. Lo yishenes aray, not a temporary sleeping. So how could Rav Ashi sleep there? So even though the shul has been collapsed, it retains its kedusha. Retains its kedusha, even after it's collapsed. Now, the Ein L'Taretz, don't answer by saying that the reason why he's allowed to sleep in the shul is this collapsed shul, but it still retains the kedusha of the shul. Don't answer by saying Mishum du Bavel Hava, because they're in Bavel, they're not in Eretz Yisrael. V'Omer Rav Asi, and Rav Asi says the Perek Basra in Megillah, the last Perek in Megillah, Masechet Megillah. Rav Asi says, Batik Nesiyas Shal Bavel, all the shuls built in Bavel, which include all the diaspora, not just Bavel, but all of Eretz Yisrael. We'll see in a moment why. Al Tanayim Nesuyas. They are all made on condition. Now, this is a statement that the Gemara does not qualify. What says that is done by Tanai? What's the Tanai? What exactly is this Tanai? Which means like this. When you build a shul, there are Tanayim you could make, depending on who's making the shul and how the shul is made. There are conditions you can make that give it different levels of Kedusha. That's depending on what the individual builders of this particular shul do. But then there is the very fact that the shul was built after the Eretz Yisrael. The Tanai exists even if you as an individual builder don't make a Tanai, or you the fundraiser, depending on who can make this Tanai. So all shuls built after the Eretz Yisrael are on Tanai. What the Tanai is, the Gemara doesn't qualify, and this is something all the Rishonim discuss in trying to understand what exactly is this Tanai that all the shuls in Bava are made. Obviously, the Tanai comes in context. Just to put it in context, the Mishnah discusses things you're not allowed to do once the shul is destroyed, and then the Mishnah quote, then the Gemara quotes a Brisa which talks about the things you're not allowed to do in a shul. You're not allowed to use it as a shortcut. You can't go in there just because you're cold and you want to warm up, and so on. Different things you're not allowed to do in the shul. And then after that, Gemara quotes Rashi and says it's on a condition. So what condition exactly is being placed on the shul? So you might suggest, Upirush Akuntis continues Tosafos, and Rashi explains, Hossam over there, that nafkamina, what's the change that's made by this Tanai? Le'inyan hadakatani le'il. Based on that, it's in regard to that which the Gemara there quoted earlier from the Brisa. Ein oichlin behen, you're not allowed to eat in the shul. Vein shoysim behen, you can't drink in the shul. Vein nechnasim behen b'chama b'pnei achama, and you can't go in there during the heat time because of the heat to cool off. Or b'kshamim in the winter b'pnei achama because it's too cold. You can't go there to warm up. Ubishel Bavel, and because of Bavel mutter, it's permissible. Right? So that's what Rashi seems to be saying there. That Rashi over there says that the reason why, the Tanai made of all the shows in Bavel is that you're allowed to eat and sleep and drink in there. So which would come out in according to Rashi, that essentially all the halachas of Kedusha, basic nesses, don't apply to the shows in Bavel. And therefore, Rashi is allowed to sleep there. The Gemara says that there are certain things you still can't do, but sleeping is not on the list there specifically. It says cheshbonis. But anyway, that's what Tosafos is suggesting. You might want to answer and say why Rav Ashi is allowed to sleep on the destroyed shul is because it's on Tanai, it's in Bavel, and you're allowed to sleep because the Tanai removes the Kedusha. Now here's why Tosafos does not like that. Because the Gemara over there says right there later in right after that Gemara from Rav Asi, which says that all the shuls in Bavel are by Tanai. The Gemara continues and says, Ravina v'Rav Ada and Rav Ada have a kaimu v'shaili shmaitem Rava. They were standing and asking a question of Rava. Asa zilcha de mitra. It started, a torrential downpour started to happen. Alayu upon them. Started to pour down raining. Mitra is rain. Zilcha Rashi translates over there to be like a heavy downpour. So what did they do? And they walked into the shul to continue their conversation. And the Gemara gives a caveat and explains, why did they go into the shul? Not because the rain made them uncomfortable and they went into the shul. Because learning requires a sound mind. So it wasn't that they went into shul to avoid the rain. They went into shul so they can concentrate and have in their conversation with Rav. Now, says Tosafos, this is the end of the Gemara of Tosafos quoting the Gemara. So says Tosafos, Vahashta, but now if you're going to argue that shows in Bavel don't have the restrictions, basic Ravina, Rav Ada, and Rava were in Bavel. If we are going to maintain Rashi's view that the Tanai in Bavel is that there's no Kedusha and you're allowed to forego all the restrictions of the shul in Eretz Yisrael, that would mean you're allowed to walk into the shul because it's pouring rain outside. So why did they have to excuse themselves and say that the reason why they're going to shul is not because of the rain, but because they need to learn properly? In Rashi's opinion, they could have walked into the shul because it was raining. They didn't have to excuse themselves. It's the charaya that Rashi's pshat isn't correct. This is what Tosafos is basically saying. He's rejecting Rashi's pshat. So the Tanai cannot be that you're allowed to disregard the restrictions on how you have to behave in a shul. That cannot be the Tanai. And gets back to our original question, how is Rav Ashi allowed to sleep in this shul even after it's destroyed? It's waiting to be rebuilt, but how is he able to sleep there? So long as the Kedusha of the shul still retains. Yesh Leimar, Tosafos Sifra suggests, the lav mamish lebasic nesses lepuraya. It's not literally that he brought a shul into his bed into the basic nesses. Elabasamach lebasic nesses, close to the shul, in the building of the shul, but not the actual shul. the Mokim Shah, Oichin Regilim Sham, it's a place where they had hospitality suites for guests to sleep in. The Lechon to eat there. Shuls historically were community centers. They had not just the shul, but they had everything. They had guest suites, and they had the Bezdin was there. They even had the Gabbai, called the Chazan HaKnesses, had a little apartment there. And the only room that retains their halacha of the shul is the actual place where you daven. Especially if we're going to say that Tosafos agrees with the Ramban that the Kedusha of a shul is based on the fact that you daven in there. Right? But even so, even if not, only the room of the shul itself gets the halacha of the Beis Knesses. I many years ago in Kollel, I learned the sugya of the Kedusha Beis Knesses by Chavrusa. And it come down to the point that today, almost none of the shuls have the original halachas of Beis Knesses. Not just because of the Tanai of Bavel, but because of the way we build our shuls. We build it lechatchila as multi-purpose rooms. It all comes down to the kavanah. Like, what's the kavanah of those who donate the money and those who build it? And all shuls, lechatchila, are built as multi-purpose rooms. You can convert them into a hall or whatnot. So right in lechatchila, our shuls don't have that level of kedusha where it's exclusively a place for davening and nothing else. Nonetheless, there's certain halachas that still apply. You can't behave disrespectfully, and you cover the aron if you're going to use it for certain things. Like if you use it for dinner, you cover the aron. But still, it doesn't have the official halacha of the Beis Knesses. So I remember reading at the time. I think it was at San Zerembe, somewhere in Poland, if I'm not mistaken, with Sanz, who wanted to have at least one room in his building of a shul that's going to have the official halacha of Beis Knesses. If I'm not mistaken, he appointed the one of the women's sections that this is going to be a halachic shul, and he didn't allow anybody to walk in there and talk if they weren't davening. If they had a bris, they wouldn't let them eat there and stam chat, because this would have the full halacha of a shul. Couldn't do anything in there. But the other rooms, you're allowed to. Well, that's what Tosafos is saying here. The place where Rav Ashi put his bed to sleep wasn't in the actual space of the shul, but on the space of the guest suites that they had in the shul for visitors. And Tosafos brings a raya that the shuls actually had such rooms and that they didn't have the same level of kedusha. As the Gemoro says in Ari Pesachim, the last Perek in Pesachim. And over there, the Gemara discusses the halacha of a din of making kiddush in shul on Friday night. A din, which, by the way, the Alter Rebbe writes in the Shulchan Aruch. There's a whole siman in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch describing the halachas of making kiddush in shul on Friday night, which I believe most Ashkenazi shuls till today do it. And for some reason, it never happens in Chabad. I don't know why. I haven't seen any. I have, later you see in a raya, just because I didn't see it's not a raya, but I haven't seen anything like from any of the Rabbeim afterwards, which say why you shouldn't. But it's just the fact that there's a whole siman out there, Shulchan Aruch, describing this halacha, but we don't do it. At any rate, and I imagine the fact that it didn't happen in the Rebbe's shul, neither the Frierdiker Rebbe shul, I imagine it didn't happen in the Alter Rebbe shul himself. I imagine, otherwise the custom would have continued, I assume. But Kaponim, the din is that there's a kiddush made in shul Friday night. And the Gemara discusses Rav and Shmuel discussing as to what exactly the usefulness of this is. And the Gemara says, Shmuel, according to Shmuel, what's the reason for this kiddush? Why do they make kiddush in shul? Says the Gemara there in Pesachim, in order for the visitors to be able to fulfill their obligation, they eat, sleep, and reside. They eat, drink, and reside in the shuls. So that's the space where Rav Ashi would have slept, in the same space that the guests would have slept, the visitors. Now we're stuck with the question, though, if we're rejecting Rashi's pshat, Rav Asi said that there is some Tanai around the building of all shuls in Bavel, all shuls in Chutz La'aretz. So Rashi said the Tanai was that you're allowed to eat and drink in the shuls. Tosafos rejected that because Ravina and Rav Ada and Rava only went into shul when it was raining because they wanted to have a clear mind to learn. They were excusing themselves because ordinarily they wouldn't have went into the shul. Is a raya that even in Bavel, you can't just go into the shul to avoid the rain. So what's the Tanai according to Tosafos? What exactly is the Tanai of Asi? So says Tosafos, that which the Gemara said in Megillah, that all Bate Knesses outside of Eretz Yisrael are al Tanai, Mefarish that he explains, the Inyan, with regard to that if it's destroyed and no longer has a kedusha, meaning it's destroyed and being put out of use, So its Kedusha is no longer there. Because again, if I'm correct, in that Tosafos is following the Shit of the Ramban, that the Kedusha of the shul comes from the Tefillah, it's Tashmishe Mitzvah, or Tashmishe Kedusha, depending on what level. But Tashmishe Mitzvah, when you're done with the mitzvah, you can throw it out. For example, a lulav is Tashmishe Mitzvah. And as soon as Sukkot is over, the lulav doesn't have any Kedusha anymore. So al derech, because the shul is a Tashmishe Mitzvah, it's a tashmish for your mitzvah of davening and learning. So once that's done, and you no longer plan on davening and learning anymore, it no longer has the Kedusha. And that's the T'nai, if this is correct, if I'm correct about Tosafos being like the Ramban, and that's the T'nai of Bava, that the Kedusha is not going to be forever. And when it's destroyed, it's over. Yasim Hamashi Yirtzi, you can do whatever you want. Levad Mekalas Rosh, except for extreme disrespectful things that you can't do there, as the Gemara describes in Megillah. So this is the Tosafos over here. And just to give a full rounded picture, we're going to quickly go through some of the pictures I sent you from the WhatsApp group, from the different sources there, which discuss this issue, and then we'll move on to the next Gemara. So start first with the picture that says Rashi Megillah Chavches. A lot of the Rishonim quote this Rashi and talk about how Rashi is of the opinion that the Tanai is that you're allowed to eat, sleep, and drink in there. The words in Rashi are not as clear as it is if you read the Tosafos, you would think that Rashi explicitly stated you're allowed to eat, sleep, and drink in shuls. But if you look at the actual Rashi, the words are not that explicit, and it could be interpreted in multiple ways. So I'm just putting it out there, and the discussion in the Achronim and whatnot. So look at the Rashi there, the picture that says Rashi Megillah Chavches. You see it's the word there is al Tanai, and Rashi says al Manash Yishtamshu Behem, on condition that they can use them. To what degree, how, where, when, Rashi doesn't qualify. But in context, it seems like he's talking about the forbidden usages described earlier, that now you are allowed to use them. And that's kind of what Tosafos is coming from. But I'm just showing it to you that's not mamish explicit, it's inference. Okay, now, look at the Tosafos from Megillah Daf Chavches. So this is a Tosafos that I Tosafos, that there's just a Geshmaka Tosafos. First of all, you'll see a consistency in the Tosafos here and there, and there's a line there from Tosafos that's so Geshmak that I just said you have to share it. So he quotes the Gemoro, it says, "But Knisha Bava al Tanai Nasoyis." So Ratzo Loimar, this means to say, what's the Tanai? Not like Rashi, which seemed to imply that the Tanai is even while the shul is standing, you're allowed to eat, sleep, and drink in there, but rather calls man shei betelin. Once they are nullified and they no longer retain their kedusha, then once they are no longer in use of tefillah, then not he sees less. Tosafos over here said charuvim when they're destroyed. Over here he says betelin. In other words, if we decide we're no longer using it for davening and learning, it no longer has the kedusha anymore, and that's the Tanai. And what's his raya that it's not a Tanai while the shul is still in use? The chazinon, because we see the brisa del il in the earlier brisa, which something else. And we see later that the Amaroim, Ravina, Rav Ada, and Rava did not want to walk into the shul because of the rain. But they only went in, they excused themselves and said the reason why they're walking into the shul is because they need a clear mind to learn, not because of the rain. So is a raya that you're not allowed to walk into the shul because of the rain? And therefore, now he uses the word charav. Now we're discussing kishacharav once the shul is destroyed. Now the condition applies that you're allowed to use it. And this is consistent with our Tosafos over here. Now Tosafos says, Dafke in Bavel does this Tanai work? Why wasn't this Tanai made in Eretz Yisrael? Why is it Dafke in Bavel the Tanai was made? Says Gavaldik. Why? When Mashiach comes, the Mehed of Yameinu may be speedily nowadays. There's no longer going to be any use for these shuls, and therefore the Kedusha is going to be gone. And because l'chatchila, when we built our shuls, we're building them temporarily because we're not here permanently. We're only here till Mashiach comes because you need a place to daven until Mashiach comes. Once Mashiach comes, goodbye to these shuls. We're gone. We don't need these shuls anymore. And therefore, l'chatchila we can make it in a Tanai that the whole thing is temporary to begin with. But those who live in Eretz Yisrael, the Mahane Tanai, you can't make any condition. The Kedusha is going to stay forever. It's a gewaldige little piece that we had to share that. Just why I'm sure it's not so pashut. I'm sure it's controversial. I'm sure there's disputes on the Tosafos, but nonetheless, it's a geschmack, a little shtickle from Tosafos that I had to share.
There was such a thing as private places where people davened in the time of Beis Hamikdash.
It's a very good shaila, and it's not mamish clear, but l'chura the answer is yes.
I mean, based on this, yeah.
L'chura the answer is yes. Well, we're talking about times of the Gemoro, which is a few hundred years after the destruction of Beis Hamikdash. But still, I think there was. The earliest reference to a shul is actually in the Beis Hamikdash. There's in the Beis Hamikdash.
I'm saying based on this, that he's saying that it'll be
it'll still be around.
Yeah, because why else would you need it if there's a Beis Hamikdash?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But if the tefillah is making karbanis, what were they doing in a shul during the Beis Hamikdash?
It's a good shaila. The basic answer is that the tefillah is a mitzvah deraisa. Zmanei tefillah is b'makom karbanis. Tefillah itself is deraisa. The zman of tefillah and the breakup of shachar.
Tefillah b'tzibur.
That's a good shaila. When exactly tefillah b'tzibur started? L'chora that started with Anshe Knesset Agdola. L'chora. It's mamish not pashat. The history of minyan, the history of shul is very unclear. Exactly when it started, and but it seems it existed before. Also, you have to remember that there were Yidden. So you're talking about Inner Yisrael, but there were Yidden who lived in the times of the Bias, certainly the Bayis Sheni, who weren't Inner Yisrael at all. They were all over they were scattered. Some stayed in Bavel, many stayed in Bavel. According to some opinions, most stayed in Bavel. There's certainly Jews in other places also. In Mitzrayim, in Rome, the Gemara talks about Yidden in Rome who wanted some sort of, they built a bama there and brought a carbon Pesach. It's not so posh. I don't know exactly. But tefillah is also, again, the shul, as we're saying, is more than just a place of tefillah. If there's a drought, there's a whole program in the Masechta Tainis of what kind of tefillahs you do and what kind of Kriyas HaTorah you do. Right, so the Gemara Taka says that you bring it to Recheva Sha'ir, but I assume it's also a place where they would get together and have shiurim and learn daven. Anyway.
And with big guest suites.
Sorry?
And with big fancy guest suites.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, apparently. Okay. Now go to the Tosafos Psachim Kuf Aleph. Over there you also see consistency in Tosafos. And you'll see an interesting specific consistency. I underlined the word there. So this is Tosafos commenting on the Gemara, which said, the Gemara that he quoted here in our Tosafos, he quoted the Gemara which said that the reason for, according to Shmuel, the reason why they have Kiddush and Shuls Friday night is in order to be mafkia, the chiyuv of the visitors. And the Gemara said, the achlu v'shasu v'ganu v'beit knishna. They eat, sleep, and drink in the shul. And they are the ones that we're making Kiddush for, according to Shmuel. So it says Tosafos from Taimar. So the Gemara doesn't say where they're sleeping. The Gemara just says they're sleeping in shul. So therefore Tosafos begins with a question. From Taimar, if you're going to ask, well, Perek we learned in Megillah, the same Gemara we quoted in Tosafos over here, but you can see it's ein oichlim behen, you're not allowed to eat in shuls, ein shoysim behen, you're not allowed to drink in them, even though eating and drinking of a mitzvah is permissible, right? For mitzvah you're allowed to. That meaning Yerushalmi, as the Gemara says in Yerushalmi, that when they were gathered, you see, there's another reason why they had a basic Knesset. They were gathering to be Mekadosh L'Chodesh. And they had, the Gemara describes a whole meal that they would have, a whole celebration around declaring the Chodesh. And continues Tosafos, Gam Achshav, even today, Noegim Lishtos Kais Avdallah or Bris Milah. So there is eating and drinking that happens in shul related to a mitzvah. But if the eating is not of a mitzvah, Vishina, and sleeping, even if the sleeping is for a mitzvah, it seems, Asr is forbidden. I'm highlighting this because Rav Ashi here is sleeping. And one could make the argument, as we're going to see in one of the Rishonim in a moment, that the reason why Rav Ashi was able to sleep there is because it's for a mitzvah. He's sleeping there so that he can remind himself to build a shul later. So maybe there's a permissibility that way. But Tosafos is consistent in saying eating and drinking for a mitzvah, yes, but sleeping certainly out of the question, even if it's for a mitzvah. L'chura. And he goes on to say, even in Bava you're not allowed to eat there, etc. And he quotes again the Gemara about Ravina and Rabbi who went inside to the rain and they excused themselves for saying that they went into the shul for a clear mind, not because of the rain. And then V'yesh Leimar at the end of Tosafos, he answers, the lav dafka b'beit knishta, they didn't actually sleep in the shuls, but in designated rooms that were next to the shul. Kari Beit Knishna, but they called it the shoals because it was in the same structure. Misham HaYishem Kiddush, and they would be there to hear Kiddush. Why were they there to hear Kiddush, not in the actual shul? The text goes on to say, the halacha is you have to have Kiddush b'makom suda. You have to have Kiddush in the place where you're going to eat. So if there's a separate room where they are dining and the separate room in the shul, so they're making Kiddush in the shul with the doors open to their guest suites where they're eating, or in our case, like Rabbi Nu always does, that opens the door to the social hall, and that way the Kiddush can be heard there, and then it's considered Kiddush b'makom suda. Okay, so that's the Tosafos there, which again, he's consistent. He's consistent in two things. Number one, he's consistent in saying that any eating and drinking doesn't happen in the actual shul, but in the room on the side of the shul. And therefore, Rav Ashi here slept on the side of the shul, not in the actual shul. And he's also consistent in maintaining that all sleeping is forbidden, even sleeping of a mitzvah, which is different than, and this is the last text we'll look at, the Haggah. Oh, they're still around here. Okay, we don't have to look at the Quran on your own if you want to, just as another answer. But I want to see the Haggah here. Do you see the Haggah in the middle of the Rosh?
The shuls that they still make Kiddush.
Sorry?
In the shuls where they still make Kiddush today, Friday night.
Yeah.
But there's nobody eating there.
Yeah. So the Alter Rebbe writes, and I assume this is, not the Alter Rebbe's Chiddush, writes that once the takana has been established, it remains. It's a whole simon dedicated. The Alter Rebbe explains why we're doing this. It seems like the Alter Rebbe is quite pro the idea of making Kiddush in shuls. Explains about it's actually quite barichistic, explaining why takana remains even though the reason for takana is no longer around. Anyway, we don't have the Alter Rebbe's simonim on Hilchos Beis HaKnesses, which would have been very nice for our sugya to know where the Alter Rebbe stands in terms of the Kiddush of the Beis HaKnesses and what the Tanai is, but we don't have that. Okay, so let's look at the Haggah of the Rosh. The Rosh himself is very similar to the Tosafos, but then there's a Haggah which says, "Variva Perish, the Beis HaKnesses mamash hayasham." Rashi would actually sleep in the actual shul. Why? That for a mitzvah you're allowed to. The heavy raya, and he brought a raya that for mitzvah you're allowed to. When they would be ma'aver the chodesh, it seems like ma'aver the chodesh is talking about making an ibor yar, adding an extra other, whereas Tosafos was talking about kiddush chodesh. I'm not really sure exactly what was point exactly the differences, but anyway, he says they would eat and sleep in the shuls. So there's a raya that you're allowed to sleep in the shul also. Let's just see here in the footnote. Here's the Gemoro. Anyway, okay, so he says that his raya is that you could even sleep in the shul. In Ken Hashim B'Shul Mitzvah Acheres, if the case is that you're allowed to sleep in a shul for the sake of some other mitzvah, to make it Ibor Yar, Mutter Kol Shekain L'Tzorech Beis HaKnesses Asman. How much more so sleeping in the shul for the sake of maintaining the dignity of the shul, which is what Rav Ashi was doing. This is also why they allowed people to sleep in the shul on Erev Kippur. I'm not sure what he's referring to there. Not sure. Okay, so you see, there's the Tosafos is consistent in that sleeping is never permissible in shul, whereas others say sleeping for mitzvah is allowed. Okay, so this concludes the relevant part of our Gemoro, which discusses the laws of Beis HaKnesses. And now we get to a gewaldige story, which I don't know if we'll finish it today, but certainly it's an unbelievable story in the Gemara. And you can take out some of the more graphic parts of the story, but I tell at dinner time, if I come across a story in the Gemara during the day, I'll share the story at the table. And this is one of their favorite stories. They want to hear the Hordus and the story. So to get the story, tell it to your children. It's a very fascinating story. You can skip the graphic parts. Sakaponim. It's about 10 lines or so from the bottom of the page. Hordus, middle of the line. The line begins with the word Akarna Tordem, and after Loihodabe, and then Hordus. So the Gemara is bringing the story because last week we learned that the Gemara asked, based on halacha, we learned that you're not allowed to destroy a shul before you built a new one in place. The Gemara asked, why did Baba ben Buta, how was Baba ben Buta allowed to advise Hordus to renovate the Beis Mikdash when l'chora during the time of renovation, the Beis Mikdash is not in use, and it's like this is the worst case scenario of destroying a shul before he built a new one. It's not as if Hordus had a temporary base midrash somewhere else. So how is he allowed to do that? And the Gemara answered two reasons. Either a king doesn't renege on his responsibility, so for sure he's going to do it, or the other answer is the Beis Midrash was pashut in such ruins that it was a public safety issue was going to fall apart. So now the Gemara is going to tell us who Hordus was, or in English, King Herod, Hordus, and what exactly this Ma'aseh with Bava Mebuta is. Okay. So it says the Gemara like this: Hordus after the Beit Hashmonoim have. Hordus was a slave to the house of the Chashmonoim. The Chashmonoim took over after the story of Hanukkah. When the Chashmonoim pushed the Greeks out, they regained sovereignty from the Greeks. They maintained that sovereignty for a couple generations. And very quickly, within a few generations, they devolved into corruption. The Chashmonayic dynasty wasn't always super pleasant. And then it was succeeded by the Hordus dynasty. And this Hordus, the story we're about to read now is how Hordus inherited the kingdom from the Chashmonaim. But by the time Hordus came around, they were already kind of vassal kings to Rome. They lost their independence and they were vassal kings to Rome. So there was a period after Hanukkah until Rome that the Jews had some independence under the Chashmonaim, tenuous because of the corruption. And then with Hordus, there's also good periods and not good periods, is worse and better. And there's a whole controversy around Hordus himself. The Gemara describes him as a slave to the house of the Chashmonaim. That's where he started out from. Exactly what his lineage is. Was he a convert, not a convert? What exactly his status was as a Jew? And Tosafos speaks reference to that over here, but we're not going to go to that discussion. Upon him, Hordus after the Bais Chashmonaim. So Hordus was a slave in the house of the Chashmonaim. Nosan Eina Ba'isa Tinoikus, and he laid eyes upon one of the young Chashmonaim girls. Yoim Machada, one day, Shama Hahu Gavra, this man, Hordus, heard, Baskala, a Baskal, the Amar which said, Call Avda the Marid Hashta, any slave which will now revolt, Matzliach will be successful. He says, this is my opportunity. Come, he got up, Katlinu Lukula, Maruse, he killed all of his masters, the Chashmonaim, whoever was left of them, V'shayir lahu Yinukta, and he left this young girl that he had laid eyes upon. Kichazahi Yinukta, when the young girl noticed the Kaboy Mitzvah, that he wanted to marry her, Salkel Igra, she went up to the roof, Virama Kala, and she yelled out, Virama Kala, she raised up her voice, Amran, she said, Call man da'asi, anyone's going to come along, V'amran, going to claim, I come from the house of the Chashmonayims. You should know he's a liar, and Avdahu, it's a slave. Whoever comes and claims that they have lineage to the Chashmonaim is a liar, they're really a slave. Why? The only one that's left is this young girl, me, and this young girl, fell off the roof to the ground. She committed suicide. She jumped off the roof. And that was it. She made an announcement. This is the end of the Chashmonayic line. Anybody who claims royalty from Chashmonai, liar, I'm gone. Now, but Hordus loved this girl. This is crazy sadistic. Tamna, he preserved her, Sheva Shnin, 7 years, Bedufsha in honey. He preserved her body in honey. Ikeda Amri, there are those who say Bala, that he engaged in necrophilia, and Ikeda Amri loy Bala, others say he didn't engage with her. The Amri le Bala, those who say that he actually engaged in necrophilia. Hadatamna, the fact that he preserved her is the tuva liyitzrei, to satisfy the taiva. Tuva comes from the word taiva, the yitzrei of his inclination, of his yetzer hara. So to satisfy the taivas of his yetzer hara. With Amri lo loy ba'ala, and those who say he didn't engage with her. So Hadatamna, the fact that he preserved her, in order that people should say bas melech nasav, so in order to hold on to his claim that he married a princess. He could say, look, there's the girl I married. She's right here, even though he didn't engage with her physically. This is exactly the opposite of Achashverosh, by the way, who Dafka married Esther, who was unknown, because he wanted to claim lineage of his own. He didn't want to say that I'm like my father-in-law's son-in-law, he wanted to have his own lineage. Anyway, Hordus wanted to maintain her to claim rights to the throne. Okay, so Amar, Hordus said to himself, Man Dorish, who is the one that learns the pasuk, which reads, the pasuk reads in Dvarim, the pasuk of the mitzvah to make a king. The pasuk says, from amongst your brethren, you shall appoint a king, meaning a Jewish king. Tosafos points out that the simple reading of the pasuk would allow for a slave to be a king, because a slave, at least to some level, is obligated in mitzvahs. And because a slave is obligated in mitzvahs, the slave could be considered achecha, your brother. But the Chachamim said it's got to be mikerev achacha, from the best of your brethren, meaning someone who's a full-on legitimate Jew. Okay. So says Hordus, who are the people which say that the only people who are allowed to be kings are legit Jews? Rabbanon, the sages do that. So the sages are the biggest threat to my throne, because they'll come along and say, look, the pasuk says he's not allowed to be king. So he got up and katlinu l'kula Rabbanon. He killed all the Chachamim. Tosafos points out there wasn't all the Chachamim. He proves from different people who were alive at the time that it couldn't have been all the Chachamim, but it was most of the Chachamim. Okay? So he killed all the Chashmonaim, preserved this girl in honey, and then killed most of the Chachamim. But Shafka, he left behind Bab ben Buta. He left behind one of the Chachamim, Bab ben Buta. What for? The Mishkal Eitzim Minei. He wanted to keep him, to give him advice. The Mishkal means to take Eitzim Minei, take advice from him. But he couldn't just leave him Stam Hazai. Ahadrele Kalila Diyale. He put on him what's those like those crowns that the Romans wear with like flowers on top. What's it called? A wreath, not a wreath. A wreath is what you put on like a grave, but like one of those round crowns with like flowers. Anybody?
Laurels.
Yeah, he made them like that, made of porcupines. And porcupine hide with the spikes. And it poked his eyes. Basically, he blinded him. He blinded Bab ben Buta. So the one time the Chacham he kept alive for advice, he blinded the guy. So Yom Echad, one day, Asa v'Yosef kamei. Hordus went and sat next to Bab ben Buta. Now Bab ben Buta doesn't recognize him because he's blind. So Omar, and basically this was a test. Hordus wanted to see where Bab ben Buta's allegiance lies. Omar, so Hordus said to Bab, the unassuming blind Talmud Chacham, Bab ben Buta, he says, Chazi Mar, Hay Avda Bisha Maika Avid, have you seen what that bad slave did? Referring to Hordus, right? He started out as a slave. Have you seen what that bad slave did? Murdering the Chashmonaim and then killing the Chachamim. Bisha means bad. So Amar Lei, so Bab ben Buta said to Hordus, not knowing who he was, my Avidle, what should I do to this guy? What should I do to Hordus? What do you want from me? Amar Lei, so he responded, Nelai Tamar, curse him. You're a sage, you got spiritual powers, give him a curse. Amar Lei, so Bab ben Buta responded, see if the pasuk reads, Gam b'mada acha, melech al takalal. Even in your mind, even in your thoughts, a king, don't curse. Don't even curse a king in your thoughts. So sorry, I can't curse Hordus for you. Amalei, so Hordus pressed him further. Hailav melechu, but this guy's not a king. He's not a legitimate king. He's a slave. You can curse him. Amalei, Bab ben Buta responded, even if he's just simply a rich man, I still can't curse him. Because Viksiv, the same pasuk that he quoted earlier in Kaiheles, continues, and in the the room of your bedroom, the privacy of your bedroom, al takala lasher, don't curse the rich man. So I can't curse him. But lo yehei ela nasi, and even if he's only not a rich man, but he's only a leader, a prince meaning a president, nasi, a president, as in a leader. If all he is a leader of the Jewish people, I also can't curse him because if the pasuk says v'nasi b'machaloi tar, don't curse the princes, the presidents amongst your community. Okay. So Amar Lei, so Hordus responded, this halacha that you're not allowed to curse a leader of the Jewish community is only if he's behaving like he's part of the Jewish community. He's behaving as if he's part of your community. But this guy's not behaving like a proper Jew. So go ahead, curse him. His mom is really pushing Bab ben Buta to see if his allegiance is going to stay with Hordus. So Amar Lei, so finally Bab ben Buta said, Mistafina mineh, I'm scared of him. I'm sorry, I'm not doing it, I'm scared of him. Amar Lei, so Hordus said back to him, unbeknownst to him that it's Hordus, Leike inish to Ozil, there's nobody here that's going to go tell him, Danav at Yasfina. It's you and I sitting here. Nobody else is going to tell him. So Amar Leah Bamba responded, see the pasuk says, it's the same pasuk he quoted before from Koheles. The bird of the heavens will carry the voice. And the one with wings, Yagid Dover, will relate the matter. No such thing as keeping a secret. You told it to one person, you told it to the whole world. And the birds will carry it if they have to. But the information is going to get there, and I'm afraid of Hordus. So Amar Le, now finally Hordus reveals his identity. And he tells him, Anahu, I'm him, I'm Hordus. And if I were to know how cautious and how prudent the sages are, so to such an extent, I wouldn't have killed them all. I see they're good people. They're such assets. They're not going to rebel against me. As an aside note, this is very consistent with the history of where the Chachamim stood B'chlal, starting from Hordus all the way down to the destruction of Beis Mikdash. There were many different camps amongst the Jewish people, and some people sided with the Romans, some people wanted to rebel with the Romans, and the Chachamim essentially they were called Perushim because they're Parush. They separated themselves from all politics, and they focused specifically on learning Torah. They never got involved, either taking the Roman side or not the Roman side. They stayed the course of teaching Torah, which is what made them very popular amongst a lot of the common folk who weren't living in Yerushalayim per se, weren't living in the big cities. They were the Chacham were very popular. I'm using mamish like vulgar historical terms, but this is the reality. They were very popular amongst the masses because they didn't get involved in all the fights that were going on in Yerushalayim. The people who were against the Romans, the people who were cozying up to the Romans, the Tzedukim, the Beryonim, and so on. So the Chachamim B'chlal stayed out of this politics things. And Hordus is basically realizing that he destroyed all these popular good people, which weren't even a threat to him. So,
what was the reason why he did that to begin with?
Because the Chachamim, he said that the Chachamim are the ones who would use the Torah to dismantle his claim to the throne by saying that he's a slave who's not allowed to be a throne, not allowed to be a king. So he's worried that the Chachamim would lead a popular uprising, questioning the legitimacy of his ascent to the throne. And now he realizes that the Chachamim aren't interested in this, and that they don't care. Like, look, I'm afraid of this guy. He's a rich guy. Hashem put him there. Not my job. I focus on learning Torah. So now he feels bad, or he feels like he did something wrong by killing all the Chachamim. So Hordus continues to Baba after revealing his identity and says, what's the solution for this man? Meaning, what should Hordus do? How do I do tshuva for killing the guy, for killing the Chachamim? Amar Le, so Baba responded, speaking to Hordus in the third person. He knows who it is, but now he's speaking to him in the third person. Who kava oidish? He, Hordus, put out the light of the world, tiksiv, because the pasuk says, "Kiner mitzvah Torah." For Torah, mitzvah's candle and Torah is light. So he put out the light of the world by killing the Chachamim or learning Torah. Yelech v'yasik ba'oidish olam. Let Hordus go and involve himself in restoring light to the world. Namely, tiksiv, because the pasuk says, with respect to the Beis Mikdash, v'norol of kagoyim, and all the people of the world were streamed there. But the Naharu comes to the term that it lights their way. In other words, the Beis Mikdash is this place that lights up the world. So you killed the light of the world by killing the Chachamim. You restore the light of the world, fix the Beis Mikdash. Okay, Ikeda Amri, others say that the way Baba Buddha told him to rebuild the Beis Mikdash was in a different form. Amalei, Baba Buddha told the Hordus, Husima Einei Shel Olam, he, Hordus, blinded the eyes of the world. Tiksiv, because it says, V'haya Inne Eina Eda. The pasuk is talking about a mistake that the Sanhedrin does, and the pasuk says that if the mistake comes from the eyes of the people, referring to the Chachamim as the eyes of the people. So, by killing the Chachamim, he blinded the eyes of the world. Also, kind of making a reference to the fact that he blinded Bamba literally. So, what should he do as a solution? Let him go and involve himself in restoring the eyes of the world, which is the Beis Mikdash. The pasuk says, the pasuk is in Yecheskel prophesizing the destruction of the Beis Mikdash, and it says there the Mikdash will be laying waste, and it refers to the Beis Mikdash as machmad einechem, the pleasantry or the beauty of your eyes. Okay. So essentially, Bab Ben Buddha is advising Hordus, you want to do tshuva, rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. Amar lei, so Hordus said back, Mistafin Malchusa, I'm afraid of the king, meaning he's afraid of Rome. Hordus is a vassal king for Rome. And she says, I'm afraid of Rome if I start rebuilding the Beis HaMikdash. Because that could be cause for that could be considered as rebellion, and it could cause trouble. So Amarle, Bab Bebuta responded to Hordus, Shader Shlicha, send a messenger, but let him take his merry time getting there. The Lezel Shasa, let him take a year to get there. The Yaakov Shasa, let him spend a year in Rome negotiating. The Lahadar Shasa, and let him take a year to come back. So you have a 3-year window. Adahachi v'hachi, and in the meantime, Satrisle, destroy the Beis HaMikdash, Ubanisale, and rebuild it. Do your renovations in the span of 3 years. And Abadachi, Hordus Taka did that. Sholchule, so finally 3 years later he gets the message back. The Beis HaMikdash has already been rebuilt. And we know from archaeological finds that Hordus was a master builder. Built Masada, built most of all the stones that you see in Yerushalayim, the large stones. If you ever go to Yerushalayim and you see stones that are embossed, where like the center of the stone is popping out, the edges are impressed. I don't know if you're talking about it. If you look at a picture of the Kaisel, you'll notice the higher stones are smaller, and they're just ordinary stones. But the lower ones, the bigger ones, have like this embossed edge, where the center is popping out and the outside is pressed in. Any stone like that, comes from Hordus, which is all over Yerushalayim. He's a master builder, clearly. He built, in Roman style, he built like a major sophisticated sewage system, which you can still visit till today. Very fascinating things to go see that Hordus built. And it seems also, this is Stam Masai, but it seems like this is the way Hordus gained popularity, because he employed millions, thousands of Jews by making them do these projects. I can't remember where I read this, that at one point, Hordus was worried he's going to have a rebellion because he had no more projects for all of his workers to do, that he just started inventing projects, telling them to redo roads and whatnot. I can't remember where I read this. This is somewhere back in my memory from a long time ago. Anyway, so in the span of 3 years, he rebuilt the Beis HaMikdash. And the Kaisel we have today, that is from Hordus, from this event. That's the Kaisel we have today. Upon him, at the end of the 3 years, Sholchule, the messenger, came back from Rome, and this was the message he got. Im lo istatarta, I pronounce this. If you didn't destroy it, al tister, don't destroy it. Vim starata, I think that's how you pronounce it. If you did destroy it, al tivni, don't rebuild it. Vim starato banisa, if you destroyed it and rebuilt it, avdi bisha, you're a bad slave. Basa davdinon, that only after you do your deed, mismalchin, then you come and ask for permission, which is exactly what he did. And then he said, then the Roman message envoy continued. Im zainach, if you plan on picking up arms, Allah, if you plan on picking up arms, safrach khan, your book is here, meaning we have your lineage. We know where you come from. Lo iraka, you're not a king. Lo baraka Hordus. Hordus is not a king, nor the son of a king. Avda kalina misavet. He is a self-freed slave. But he's not a real king. We know who you are. And the end it was too late, because he did rebuild the Beis HaMikdash and made it beautifully. The Gemara comments, my Raka, what exactly is this terminology, Raka, when we're referring to a king? Says the Gemara Malchus, it's referring to a king. The Ksiv, the Pasuk says, 2 psukim that use the term Raka for a king. One pasuk is, David HaMelech says, during one of the rebellions he's dealing with, he says, Anochi hayom rach, I am today weak, but a Mashuach Melech, I'm still anointed as king. So you see this term rach, weak, used for a king. So it's like it seems like it's a derogatory way of speaking about a king, like he's a weak king. But nonetheless, it's a reference to a king. Others say another pasuk which indicates that the word rach in reference to a king, Ema Macha, could be it comes from here, which this is from Yosef. After Yosef is appointed as viceroy, it says that they put him onto a horse and they paraded him around Egypt, and they announced before him Avrech, young man. They referred to him as young man. And again, avrech, young man, the second syllable is rach, weak. Again, these are all important little nuances because they're kind of telling Hordus, you're a weak king and you're only a vassal king. You're like Yosef, who's second in command. Not like we're like Pharaoh. You're Rach like Yosef. You're just the second in command. Anyway, so two psukim that indicate that the terminology Rach refers to a king. So says the Gemara, and I guess we're going to conclude with this line. Amri, they said, Mi shaloi ra binyan Hordus, someone who'd never seen the structures of Hordus, loi ra binyan nami yamav, never saw beautiful buildings. This is the Gemara's comment on Hordus. And Mitzvah tomorrow, before we go right there in the Gemara is going to give us some very interesting details about exactly how Hordus built the Beis Hamikdash and how beautiful it looked and how impressed the Chachamim were with the work he did. Okay, I hope you found the story as fascinating as I do.
Shkoyach, thank you very much.
And actually, we're going to see tomorrow a connection to Purim in right there when we learn more story about Hordus. We're going to see a connection to Purim in a moment. And tomorrow, good morning. All right, good night.
Shkoyach, thank you.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.